Yeah, let's move on to talk about David's archaeological evidence for the kingdom of David. And yeah, as Bible readers, we might expect David to, he's so famous from the Bible. He is one of the most popular guys from the Old Testament, and he's quoted many places, all his Psalms. There's almost 2 books about his life. So it may come as a surprise for you, but there's hardly any evidence for David in the archaeological record. That is really strange. So how come that a king like David would leave a massive impression in the archaeological record, like castles, fortresses, seal impressions, maybe even a crown? How come that we don't have so much evidence from David? Hardly anything. Copenhagen is famous for something called the Copenhagen School. Some of you may have heard about the Copenhagen School. In my opinion, it's not the best thing to be famous for. But the Copenhagen School was a group of scholars primarily based in Copenhagen who had a very skeptical view on the history of the Bible. And Niels Peter Lemke, who was a professor of Old Testament at the University of Copenhagen, he's retired now, but he wrote something like this and similar things like this. It is a safe assumption that it will not be possible to present archaeological material that would make it likely that a large Judean kingdom existed at all in the 10th century before Common Era. And the 10th century is a century associated with David, according to biblical chronology. So in short, he would say that David, he is a myth. It's fiction. So all the legends, all the stories about David, they are legendary, written much later by some author who would kind of make this great projection. He would make this portrayal of a golden era in the past, a fantastic past for this Jewish people. But it would be pure fiction, according to Niels Peter Lemke. And so when we talk about the kingdom of David, this is really a huge discussion in biblical scholarship and in biblical archaeology. Did David exist at all? And if he did, what kind of kingdom did he rule? And is the Bible at all trustworthy on this period? Before going into the detail, I think it's worthwhile presenting a bit about the nature of archaeology. I mentioned in my last lecture that archaeology is a scientific discipline in its own right. It is very different from theology, in which I'm trained, and it has sophisticated methods. It's very difficult to go from a very small object found in Tel Shiloh or somewhere else to a conclusion that pertains to the Bible. There's a lot of things to go through, a lot of thinking to go through, because archaeology is difficult as a discipline, and we should respect that. So the nature of archaeology, or the challenge, you could say, or the limitations of archaeology, is that only a fraction of archaeological material withstands the test of time. So a lot of material, of course, is just disappearing after a few years. Most of it. We don't have much textual evidence from Israel because apparently they wrote on on papyri or some other material that would decay after a few years. They didn't write on clay tablets like in Mesopotamia, or they didn't apparently write big reliefs like in Egypt that would, be able to, that would exist for many years, even today. So apparently a lot of information has been lost over time. And only a fraction of archaeological sites have been found. We know quite a few archaeological sites in Israel, but we cannot identify everything from the Bible. There are a lot of biblical sites in the Bible that we cannot identify with certainty. Only a fraction of those identified sites have been excavated because it's immensely expensive to do an excavation. In Shiloh, they dig for four weeks each year. That's not a long time. 4 weeks, I guess it costs a fortune to do that because they have to bring in a lot of material, a lot of people, etc. Only a fraction of excavated sites are actually dug. So it's not that you just dig the entire mount of Tel Shiloh. You go dig a few squares every season, and you try to dig the right place where you can get that information that you want to find, because it's impossible to dig everything. It would be too expensive, and also be a shame for future generations, because you can only excavate once. Only a fraction of the archaeological material is documented, and that is perhaps shocking. It's not that you document everything. You document only a fraction of what you find, because most of what you find is perhaps not so easy to document. If you find a small potsherd, but you cannot really identify who made it or from where comes this potsherd, you cannot really use it. So you have to find the right stuff to document it and to use it for making some archaeological inferences. And only a fraction of the documented material is incorporated in historical reconstruction. That's also shocking, but it's not like all archaeologists, all biblical scholars read everything published, because that's almost impossible. So there's a lot of information lost. That's my main point. There's a lot of information lost because of how complex archaeology is. But that doesn't mean that we can't say anything. We can say a lot of things, but we have to take this in mind when we hear about that there's no evidence for David. Okay, that could be one of those reasons that we don't know much about David today from the archaeology. This is another picture that shows something about how complex archaeology is. This is a picture from, I think actually from the Holy of Holies, if we agree that this is actually the Holy of Holies of Tel Shiloh. And just look at how many small, this is called loci, a locus. It's not even it's a kind of part of a layer. So we have a lot of different loci that kind of belongs to different periods. And all of these have to be linked to other loci elsewhere in order to make a broader conclusion about the dating of each of these sites. And this is just, I'm not an archaeologist, so for me this is just a mess. Perhaps for you too, I don't know. But of course archaeologists, they are trained to interpret this and do that very well. But it is complicated, and we should respect that as biblical scholars, and when we try to make some historical conclusions from data like this. So, put differently, what can archaeology be used for and what can it not be used for? Limitations first. Not everything written in the Bible can be found archaeologically. So sometimes you hear about archaeology searching for Noah's Ark. expeditions searching for Noah's Ark in some places, because they assume that if it existed, they must be able to find it, apparently. But I think it's highly unlikely that we would ever be able to find Noah's Ark, because it was built of wood, and we don't expect that to last for several thousand years. It may exist, but may not. Okay, not everything that is excavated in Israel or the Middle East can be found in the Bible. It is not everything. The Bible was not interested in everything in Israel. It was interested in God's story with his people, and the places which are relevant to that story and to what the Bible is interested in is recorded. But there are also a lot of things that we find archaeologically that are not recorded in the Bible. So we should be aware of assuming connections between the Bible and archaeological sites or archaeological finds too quickly. There may not be a match. And finally, archaeology cannot prove the Bible. We can make probable the history of the Bible probable, but we cannot prove it. And of course, we can never prove that what God did. It's always a matter of faith. But archaeology can shed light on customs and practices, and that is both interesting and can help us read the Bible. It's also important to verify some of the customs that we have in the Bible, that it's not unlikely. The Bible is not unlikely because of this particular archaeological find. And it can help us to understand the biblical history, and it can confirm biblical places, events, and persons. So there's quite a few persons from the Old Testament that are actually confirmed by the archaeological record. For example, Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, we have seal impressions with his name. So we actually know, and we know many other kings from the Bible, they're actually present in the archaeological record, so we can confirm them. We cannot confirm everything from their life, and we cannot confirm that God used them or spoke to them, but we can use archaeology to confirm the historical situation. Okay, let's go back to 1993. And as I entered this house, I thought, I realized, this is an important year. You're really celebrating 1993 in this house. I'm referring, of course, to the foundation of this faculty. But 1993 is also an important year for biblical archaeology, because before 1993, critical scholars would say David is a fictional character in the Bible. He didn't exist at all. We don't have anything from David or witnessing to the existence of David. But that changed in 1993. So critical scholars can still be critical towards the narratives that we have about David, but it's very difficult to deny the mere existence of David. And that is due to what is known as the Tel Dan stela. And the Tel Dan stela was a stela erected by an Aramaic king, kind of a monument proclaiming his victory over two kings, an Israelite king and a king from Jerusalem. It was found in 1993 by Gila Cook in an excavation led by Avraham Biran, and it is dated to 795 before Christ. And it's actually the event that this monument is about is also narrated in the Bible. So here's I believe a match between an archaeological find, a text from the archaeological record, and the Bible. the most important thing from this stela, or the most famous thing at least, is that it mentions a king of the house of David. So the monument tells about a war between an Aramaic king and a coalition between an Israelite and Judahite king. And this king from Judah is known as the king of the house of David. And so this is the earliest reference to David in archaeological record. And after that, it's very difficult to deny the existence of David. David was certainly a man who founded a dynasty with a king in Jerusalem. So David is confirmed, but that doesn't tell us much about his life and how his kingdom looked like. After all, it's, I don't know, maybe from 850 before Christ, but that's also much later than the biblical account of David, which is about 1980 years before Christ. So we are talking about a fragment about 150 200 years after David. So let's go on a treasure hunt and see what we can find about David in the archaeological record that we have. And to do that, we first go to Jerusalem, of course, the capital of David according to the Bible, which is a dream and nightmare of any archaeologist. I think any archaeologist would love to dig in Jerusalem. It's a fascinating city, and this is where we would expect to find the most clear evidence of David's kingdom. Perhaps his palace, perhaps some administrative buildings, seals of David, stuff like that. It's also a nightmare because Jerusalem has been occupied the last 3,000-4,000 years. It's also been destroyed many times from early on and through the time of Jesus, through the Crusades, etc. So Jerusalem has been through many disasters, and that of course affects what we can expect to find. When people would settle in a city like Jerusalem that has just been destroyed by the Romans, for example, they wouldn't be so careful to protect the remains for the sake of future archaeologists. They didn't really think in those terms. They would of course take what was left. If there were some bricks left, stones that they would use that for their own buildings. Or maybe they would get rid of the old shit and start over digging and reach the bedrock and start over. So we can expect to find many very early buildings that would have been destroyed over the course of history. Jerusalem is famous for David, of course, and a part of Jerusalem is called City of David even today. And according to 2 Samuel, the King David and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking, "David cannot come in here." Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul." Therefore it said, "The blind and the lame shall not come into the house." And David lived in the stronghold and called it the City of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. So from this passage, although it's a bit tricky and perhaps confusing, but we at least get two historical claims. First, Jerusalem was already inhabited and fortified by the time of David. And secondly, after David had conquered the city, he further fortified it and built it. He built the city all around from the Milo inward. And Milo is just a transliteration of the Hebrew word, and we don't really know what that is. But he built some of it, and there was also some of it already there when he came to Jerusalem. Something that can be dated to the time of David or even earlier is this steps stone structure. And I think it's actually in the model you have in the next room. I think it's actually represented on the model. The step stone structure is a artificial foundation for some huge building on top of that. And archaeologists discuss, because I think there are some remains from a big building on top of it, and the archaeologists discuss, is this the David's palace or something else? And there hasn't come a consensus about this, and probably there won't come for the foreseeable future. But this stepstone structure, in any case, was a huge foundation for some ground building on top of it. And the archaeologist Amichai Matzah writes, a building of these proportions is unparalleled in comparison with other architectural remains from Israel and its neighbors from the 12th to 10th centuries before Common Era. And that means that Jerusalem wasn't just a small village, as often claimed, that Jerusalem couldn't be a capital because it was just a small village. You cannot expect Jerusalem to be kind of the capital of David's grand kingdom. But according to Mazar, was actually exceptional, this kind of structure in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, by implication, was an important city at this time, although it wasn't perhaps that big as sometimes expected when we read about David and Solomon. They had to reign a huge empire. Maybe not. Maybe we have misread what the Bible says about those kingdoms. Okay, let's move on, because that's not the only thing that can be dated to David or even before David. Since the 90s, the archaeologists Ronnie Reich and Eli Sukron has conducted new excavations in the underground of the city of David. So relatively frequently you will hear news from the city of David, both from the time of David but also from the time of Jesus. It's very interesting in general to follow this excavation, and if you ever go to Jerusalem, do go see the city of David and walk the tunnel of Hezekiah and see all the remains from this historical part of the city. Okay, it's long been recognized that there was the underground of the city of David is interesting, because the channels there, we have the tunnel of Hezekiah, which is also mentioned in the Bible, and you can walk 500 meters or something like that you can walk, and this is a very interesting part of the city. But recently they found new evidence, quite striking evidence of massive underground constructions. It's very difficult to take pictures underground of big constructions for obvious reasons. So it's perhaps not so easy to see what this is. But this is a underground water reservoir beneath the surface near the spring of Gihon. And it's approximately 14 meters wide, 10 meters long, and 15 meters deep. This is huge. And it is dated to the 17th or 18th century before Christ. So that is 7 or 800 years before David. So this has nothing to do with David, except that this is what he met when he came to Jerusalem to take the city. This is what he met. an underground water reservoir of massive dimensions. And you can see on the model, you can also see the Kidron Valley with the spring of Gihon in the valley. And Jerusalem at that time was dependent on this Gihon spring in the valley. It was very difficult to defend. Jerusalem was located on a hilltop. The water was in the valley. So how could you protect that water source in times of war? So they built this to gather water. They also wanted to protect it. So they built a massive tower, a spring tower, as it is called today, of approximately 14 meters wide and 17 meters long. That is 230 square meters. That's a tower. That's a big tower, and more than that, it's besides, it's also the wall towards the valley. The valley floor was 7 meters wide. So it was really a massive fortification before the time of David. This is a proposal of how Jerusalem might have looked like at the time of David. You see, there's no temple. The temple of Solomon would have been on the top, but at the time of David, it wasn't there. This is the place of the stepstone structure, and on top of that, we would expect some kind of palace, but we haven't, as I mentioned, we haven't identified that with certainty yet. And we have known this kind of layout of the city for many years, but what is new is that based on those new excavations from the 19th and onwards, archaeologists have started to illustrate the city with these external fortifications. And this is the large spring tower, and below this spring tower is this massive water reservoir and this underground Gihon spring or source. So this is what met David, and that might explain and correlates well with what we know from Second Samuel, of course, 2 Samuel, that the inhabitants of Jerusalem are very confident. You will not come in here, even the blind and the lame will walk you off. They were so confident, and we know why. Because of these fortifications. The spring tower would make it almost impossible to conquer that part of the city, at least the most crucial part of the city, because that's where the natural water resource was located. Okay, that was Jerusalem. Let's move on to another interesting site, Khebet Keyaffa, which is, I guess, less well known. It may be a biblical site. I'll come back to that. But Khebet Keyaffa was found, I think it's been known for many years, because everywhere in Israel you see archaeological remains, ruins, but not everything is excavated, of course. But Khebet Keyaffa was excavated not so many years ago and turned out to be very important for reconstructing the historical time of David. Khebet Keyaffa is located here near the Philistine city of Gath and south west of Jerusalem. And Khebet Keyaffa was located on the border between Israelites in the highlands and the Philistines along the coast. And an archaeologist discussed, could this be a Philistine city or an Israelite city? What was the function of that? But it had a short span of occupation, which is interesting. Unlike Tel Shiloh, which is, has been occupied for thousands of years, with breaks, gaps in between, of course. But Kirke Jaffa was only occupied between 1015 through 1969 before Christ. So about 40-50 years at the time where Saul and David were kings in Jerusalem according to the Bible. It is 28 kilometers from Jerusalem toward Gath. It has 2 gates, which is interesting. Usually a city of this size would only have 1 gate because gates are the most vulnerable part of a city, so you won't have too many gates. They're hard to defend. But this one had 2 gates, and it may be an important link to relate it to the Bible, because we know from 1 Samuel 17, which is a chapter dealing with David and Goliath, that after David had killed Goliath, the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'araim as far as Gath and Ekron. And Sha'araim means 2 gates in Hebrew. So there was a city known for its 2 gates, which is, must have been exceptional. Otherwise, you would probably given it another name. And we found this city, Kirke Jaffa, with 2 gates. And it is in exactly that place where you would expect this city or town, because we have many more place names in the story of David and Goliath, and which makes it possible to locate the geographical setting of that account. Kirke Jaffa is also exceptional in that it's an impressive structure. I took this picture myself when I visited Kirke Jaffa perhaps 10 years ago, and you can still see the walls standing, and they're beautiful even to this day, and they've been there for 3,000 years, and they're about 4.2 meters thick, which corresponds to an Egyptian measurement. So it means that it was a building of international standards, and whoever built it must have imported or gathered information or know-how from Egypt, or from at least someone who knew these building techniques. So this is not something that you would expect local peasants to build just overnight. This is a building construction project that would require many resources and know-how. By the way, casemate walls are walls, 2 walls with a gap in between that you could fill in times of war to get a massive wall, rather than 2 separate walls. So, in short, this is proof of exceptional building quality, and this points to, I would say, several things. First, it points to a conflict. You wouldn't do that if you were not in danger. So there must have been some conflict that someone wanted to protect his country and build this. And that person must have been powerful, and he must have attracted resources or building constructors from the outside. This is not just something local peasants would be able to do. So let's zoom out to a broader picture of the situation at that time, namely the struggle between the Israelites and the Philistines. According to 1 Samuel, the Philistines were a dominant power at that time. Here you see an example of Philistine bichrome pottery, that is pottery with 2 colors, and they're very ornate in comparison to the ones I showed last lecture, the Israelite ones, which were plain and with no ornamentation. From 1 Samuel we read that there was a hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. So the first Israelite kings was fighting against the Philistines, and the fight was hard. And perhaps even more telling, according to 1 Samuel 13, there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords all spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. So this is very telling of the dominance of the Philistines at this time, that they controlled weapon production and they controlled tool production because they wanted to oppress the Israelites as much as they could and control this region. Another fact from 1 Samuel, Jonathan defeated, the son of Saul, Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And Geba is situated in the central part of this hill country. This is the heartland of the Israelite region, in the central part of the central highland. So this is also telling of Philistine dominance, that they had a garrison inside this region, Israelite region. They controlled almost everything at this time. So this might explain why, if we assume that it was an Israelite king who built Kiryat Arba, I think we can, why he would build Kiryat Arba. He would do that to protect his people against the Philistines and gain more power for himself. We know the Philistines from many sources. In other historical sources, they are known as the Sea People, because the Philistines were part of a big group of people who arrived from the sea, from the Mediterranean, from Cyprus, from Crete, from Greece, and other islands. They would arrive in Israel and along the coast of the Mediterranean, from Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, even Syria, and they would do so and settle down and pose a major threat to the existing powers. So we hear from historical records that the Egyptians were occupied with fighting the Philistines. We hear it from the other major power at the time, the Hittites. They will also be fighting against the Philistines, or the Sea People. So it's not surprising that the Bible also tells about the fight between the Philistines and the residents who were already there, the Canaanites and the Israelites. In this, some of you have already taken these magazines, and please serve yourself. I don't want to bring it back to Copenhagen. In this magazine, I write about some dramatic settlement patterns at the time of David. And so the story goes that, how it went was that around 1200 before Christ, there was an emergence of hundreds of new villages in the central highland. And this is the central highland, but also there was also new villages east of Jordan and in the Galilee and even in the north. Hundreds of new villages came out of nothing, and scholars discuss where would they come from? Were they nomads from outside the country? Was it citizens from the cities who decided to move in the countryside and start over? Who was it? And I think it's reasonable to believe that this was nomads. These were nomads Israelite nomads coming from the east after the wilderness and settling down in central Israel. So they did that around 1200 before Christ. But what happened later, around 1000 before Christ, 200 years later, another dramatic development took place. So all of these new villages, almost all of them were abandoned around 1000 before Christ. You can see it here. All of these areas were kind of emptied, and the population was concentrated in the central highlands. Almost all of the villages were abandoned, except for a few who grew in size and were fortified. So we see kind of a double development. Some were abandoned, most of them were abandoned, and a few of them grew in size and were fortified. This is another illustration of this development. This is from a book by Avram Faust and Sef Faber, two Israeli archaeologists, and you see from 1200 there's a lot of new villages coming. This is just a few of them. They didn't include every village from this period, but a lot of new villages were established in 1200 BC, and almost all of them were abandoned in 1000 BC because of some crisis. A few of them existed all through Iron Age, and later on a number of new villages were established. But there was a crisis, and what was that crisis about? If one village is abandoned, it can be an accident, but if a lot of villages are abandoned, there must be an explanation. It's not just random that people in general leave their villages to settle down in a new place. So scholars have discussed, could it be climate changes? Could it be nomadism, that the inhabitants were nomad for in a certain period of time? They would live in cities or towns, and then later on they would move out, and then will come back, and so forth. Could it be forced immigration, that the inhabitants were forced to live another place? Or could it be because of security issues? In this book that I just referred to, the book by Avram Faust and Sef Faber, called The Bible's First Kings, dealing with Saul, David, and Solomon, they discuss these different aspects, but they argue that it must have been, the primary reason must have been security issues. It must have been security issues because that's the easiest way to explain this dramatic development in how people lived. It explains why people would leave small, unprotected villages and move to bigger ones, or the ones that they lived in would improve the fortifications of those villages. So in short, Faust and Faber argue that there must have been an external threat to these people, and the obvious answer is the Philistines, because the Philistines were known to be a threat to the existing powers. So because of the Philistines, the Israelites abandoned their unprotected villages and settled down in larger towns to protect themselves. And along the same line of argument, they must also have, at that time, been motivated or wanted to have a king, because a king could organize his people and protect them against their enemies. So the archaeological record of all of these settlements and the development, this drastic development that takes place, all point to a conflict between the people in the highland, known as the Israelites, and the Philistines, and that conflict would lead the Israelites to select a king and to build constructions like Kirbet Kayafa and other structures to protect themselves. We see other additional settlement patterns. After 1000 BC, at the time of David, according to the Bible, we see that Philistine megacities shrink. The Philistines had megacities. Ashkelon, for example, one of these Philistine cities, was 60 hectares big, and Gath were 50 hectares. By contrast, the highland villages were about half or 1 hectare each. So the contrast between the big cities along the coast and the tiny villages in the highland were just massive. But after 1000 BC, we see from archaeologists see that these megacities shrink. They lose their population. Ekron, one of the Philistine cities, lost 80% of its population at this time. So something drastic happened to the Philistines, the former major power of this region. Suddenly they start to disappear. Some of they abandoned some of their own unprotected villages, but they also adopt local script. They used to have their own script, their own way of writing the language, but then they start adopting the local Phoenician script and they start to adopt local culture and begin to assimilate with the existing population. So it also suggests that their power status had diminished at that time. In the Negev, in the southern part of Israel, at this time 350 new settlements were established. This is Negev between the Dead Sea and the Red Sea, so in a desert region. This is not where you would expect people to want to live, because this is very arid, a very arid region and very difficult living circumstances. But 350 new settlements were established in the Negev at that time, and the best explanation is probably that a king in the highland would want to control this area. Perhaps he forced people to live here, and he wanted to control this region because he wanted to control trade from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, trade from Arabia to the Mediterranean. That was a major income possibility for a king if he could control that trade. Another thing is that in this part of the country there were many copper mines, and the king wanted to control the access to the copper mines and also capitalize on that. Okay, so to conclude this, it seems that we have two separate developments. First, a development that forced the highland population, the Israelites, to concentrate in fewer cities to oppose a major Philistine threat, and then actually by this process gained the upper hand and secondarily forced the Philistines to retreat and to abandon some of their villages and to start assimilating to their culture. And furthermore, that this king in Israel established new settlements in the Negev desert and used this to expand his empire and to to capitalize on the trade in the region. So in conclusion, King David was already confirmed in 1993, and that changed the scholarship on David. Apart from that, we only have few, if any, direct evidence of David, which is surprising, but could be because of archaeological matters, the limitations of archaeology. Or maybe tomorrow you will see a news in the newspaper saying we have found David's palace. Everything is possible. Not everything. Most things are possible in archaeology. You never know. But we do have a lot of indirect evidence. I have mentioned settlement patterns in the highlands, in the Philistine region, in the Negev region, but there are also other settlement patterns east of the Jordan River, also up in the north of Israel. We have fortifications that point to a conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines. We have the importance of Jerusalem at this time. It was not just a small village at this time. It was an important city and an ideal place for a king. So in short, the best explanation for some of these indirect evidence is that a king in Jerusalem. And why not just call him David? Yeah. Thank you.